Pete Hegseth is a drunken idiot. But that doesn't mean that he's too stupid to know the truth. The truth that Israel started this war, that Israel brought us into this war, and that Israel wants to continue this war on Iran as a pretext to steal more territory and cause more chaos in the entirety of the Middle East. Pete Hegseth knows that to be true, which is why when he was confronted with that truth, he had no other choice but to cancel his press conference abruptly. In the middle of it, you can see him buttoning up his jacket and run out the room as more questions are asked, because more questions need to be answered. We are going to get into it all, but before we do, if I could quickly ask you to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already and you enjoy our channel, to hit that subscribe button because it goes a long way in supporting our work. Now, but they can't be by Pete Hegseth because he will just melt down. And that is exactly what we saw through most of the press conference he gave this morning. I want to take a look at some of those clips before we get to him running away, melting down, and exposing the truth of this conflict by refusing to admit it. But what Pete Hegseth did try to spin or say or get through was one of the dumbest things I've ever heard about the Strait of Hormuz.
As a direct gift from the United States to the world, we have established a powerful red, white, and blue dome over the strait. American destroyers are on station supported by hundreds of fighter jets, helicopters, drones, and surveillance aircraft, providing 24/7 overwatch for peaceful commercial vessels. Except Iran's, of course.
So, according to this administration, our gift to the world is reopening the Strait of Hormuz after we were the ones who got it closed in the first place. But here's the problem with that gift. It's not actually open. They are still firing at US vessels. There were just strikes on small boats throughout the strait. It is not open and free, and it's certainly not a situation where everyone is singing Kumbaya and waving at each other as they pass on the water. That is not what is happening on the ground. But Pete Hegseth is out here insisting that this is some grand gesture of peace. He's being confronted about a ceasefire that doesn't actually seem to exist because, and I'll say it again for the people in the back, they are still fighting in the strait. You can't call it a gift to the world when the world is still watching ships get blown up in a war you helped escalate.
Last 24 hours or so, Iran's fired at us, we fired at Iran. I'm just going to ask you more directly, is the ceasefire over?
No, the ceasefire is not over. Ultimately, this is a separate and distinct project, and we expected there would be some churn at the beginning, which happened. And we said we would defend and defend aggressively, and we absolutely have. Iran knows that. And ultimately, the president's going to make a decision whether anything were to escalate into a violation of a ceasefire. But certainly we would urge Iran to be prudent.
So Pete says it's our gift to the world that the Strait of Hormuz is open, even though it's really not. And it not being open doesn't constitute any interruption in the ceasefire, which means Donald Trump is just completely capitulated and given up. And as we'll talk about more when we get into Pete Hegseth running away in just a second, there's also not a complete ceasefire because Israel is still bombing southern Lebanon. And Donald Trump is so weak that he won't stand up to Israel. And Donald Trump is so weak that he's capitulated on the strait. And speaking of capitulation, Pete Hegseth was asked about Donald Trump capitulating, and he just didn't have a good enough answer.
On the first day of this conflict, President Trump addressed the Iranian people directly and said, when we're finished, take over your government. It'll be yours to take. And then on the seventh day of the conflict, in a Truth Social post, the president said, quote, there will be no deal with Iran except, all caps, exclamation mark, unconditional surrender. What happens to that pledge to the Iranians? And when did the president decide to capitulate on his demand for unconditional surrender?
Well, James, I wouldn't, you started out nicely, but you ended exactly where we knew you would end. The president hasn't capitulated on anything.
Seriously, how exactly does Donald Trump hold the cards here? What political or military concession have we actually gained from this entire war? Listen to the logic, or lack thereof. Trump is out here claiming that Iran's navy is 1,000 years old, but also bragging that we destroyed it and that it's some legendary victory. He's making the same exact argument about their air force. He says it's old as hell, but then wants a pat on the back for blowing it up. Think about that. If their equipment is ancient and can't fight in any real capacity, then why does destroying it matter? None of this adds up. Every single argument they offer is just blatantly and patently false. The truth is, Donald Trump is the one who caves. Donald Trump is the one who capitulates. He doesn't hold the cards Benjamin Netanyahu does. Trump is just following the script he's been handed. And it's exactly why Pete Hegseth literally cut the press conference short and ran away the second he was pressed on the details. He knew he couldn't defend the lie.
Cosgrove with Zero Hedge. In recent weeks, both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's head of Mossad have stated their intent not to cease combat with the Iranians. Netanyahu put this on Twitter. Israel's head of Mossad said Israel's goals are not finished until the Iranian government collapses. And so they're referring to the government that President Trump has brokered a ceasefire with and is working on a lasting peace in the region with. And so that's something many Americans, especially American farmers, are hoping he does get to a lasting peace. And so if President Trump is successful in that and the Israelis are explicitly stating their intent to continue fighting at a later date, how can you ensure America doesn't get roped back into a war if that comes? And secondly, with Netanyahu comfortable tweeting something like that out, and also Netanyahu has continued bombing Lebanon despite President Trump explicitly telling him not to.
I would say your question is based on the false premise that somehow President Trump is being pulled in by Prime Minister Netanyahu to any of these actions. And that's where you're going. Just to be clear, President Trump has led at every step of this based on his view of American interest and America first. And we're grateful that Israelis have been very capable partners at many steps of this. And they may have some objectives at times that are slightly different than ours. But there's only one hand on the wheel ultimately directing this, whether it's Project Freedom or previously Operation Epic Fury, and it's President Trump. So we're grateful for their input, their insights, the existential nature of the threat they face from an Iranian bomb, the capabilities that they can bring to that, but ultimately the coordination will happen with the leadership of President Trump. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's be very clear about one thing. The Israeli government does not want this war to end. They need this war to justify every other conflict they are starting. This war on Iran is just a pretext to move into Lebanon, claiming they are wiping out Hezbollah, while starting yet another fight under the guise of self-defense or a preemptive strike. They love that term, preemptive strike, don't they? Well, we are more than 60 days into this war on Iran. What has it actually done? What exactly were we preempting? It's obvious. The objective here is chaos. They need chaos in the region to fuel an illegal and immoral territorial expansion. That is the goal. So when people say their objectives are slightly different than ours, no, their objectives are completely different. The objective of the American government should be to protect Americans. It should not be to send billions of taxpayer dollars to a regime that is showing itself to be inherently violent in the region. A regime that seems intent on destroying or displacing the population surrounding them. We are talking about the illegal seizure of the West Bank and a push for a mass exodus of Palestinians out of Gaza. Look at the polling. A broad majority of that secular voting base believes there are no innocents in Gaza, not even children. That is the reality we are bankrolling. Their objective is a campaign of displacement and destruction that they've already begun. So no, the interests aren't mostly aligned. They are polar opposites. And that is exactly why Pete Hegseth refused to answer the question. That is why he abruptly cancelled his press conference and literally ran away. He cannot confront the truth that he is working on behalf of a foreign power whose interests do not align with the United States. There is zero US interest that justifies a forever war costing us hundreds of billions of dollars, 13 American lives, and hundreds of injured service members. And we don't even know the real numbers. Why would we? Our government lies to us every single day. Pete Hegseth stood there and lied, claiming our interests are aligned with Israel's. They aren't. Israel's goal isn't stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. If it was, we wouldn't be further from that goal than when we started. New intelligence shows Iran is still 9 to 12 months away from a weapon, if they even wanted one. Remember the Iran nuclear deal under Obama? They weren't developing a weapon then, and there was zero intelligence to suggest they were trying to before Donald Trump started these strikes. There is no part of this policy that serves our nation. And if we are going to talk about nuclear weapons, there is some very important reporting regarding Israel's own nuclear arsenal. Questions we aren't allowed to ask, but that we are going to talk about right now. John Hudson reports. Scoop. more than 24 House Democrats are pressing the Trump administration to publicly acknowledge Israel's undeclared nuclear weapons program, a move that would abandon decades of US policy but confirm what has been an open intelligence secret amongst officials since the late 1960s. The questions are, what nuclear weapon capability does Israel have? Please provide information on any nuclear weapon system that Israel fields, including warheads and launchers. Regarding fissile material production capacity, does Israel currently possess enrichment capabilities, and at what level? You could easily make the argument that Israel's nuclear arsenal is actually the most terrifying factor in the entire region right now. Think about it. Israel was somehow able to pressure Donald Trump into a war with Iran that we didn't need and didn't want to be in. So, we have to ask, how did they do it? Was it the threat of a nuclear escalation that they would start? Did they threaten to begin dropping nuclear weapons on Iran if we didn't step in? Because that is exactly what has been reported about the threats Benjamin Netanyahu has made to other American presidents, basically telling them that if the US doesn't fight his wars, he'll pull the nuclear trigger himself. That puts us in much greater danger than anything happening in Iran. That brings us closer to a global nuclear breakout than any other factor on the map. That is just the cold, hard truth. We are talking about a foreign power reportedly using its nukes, which they absolutely have, by the way, as a blackmail tool against the United States. And it is beyond insane that the UN is not allowed to monitor, investigate, or even run basic safety checks on those weapons. We aren't even allowed to talk about them in the mainstream press. There is zero oversight, zero accountability, and zero transparency. That is absolutely wild. How is that not the biggest threat? If a foreign government is using a nuclear arsenal as a gun to the head of the President of the United States to drag us into another forever war, that is terrifying. It is a massive breach of our sovereignty, and it's something that needs to be called out every single day until we get real answers. We are going to keep demanding those answers right here on this show. If you want to support this kind of unfiltered, high-stakes reporting, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button right now and leave a like on this video. And for the real ones who stuck around until the very end to hear the truth they won't tell you on TV, drop a blue heart in the comments. Keep on fighting, y'all. Do not let them silence you. I'm Liam Prescott, and I'll see you in the next one.